Germany, 1945. 12 years of dictatorship and 6 years of war are over. The people who called themselves the master race face the ruins of their past. An occupied country, utterly demoralized. The old values have been thrown out, a new order has yet to be established. Spectacular criminal cases are testimony to an era in which the world has been turned upside down. Smuggling and attacks, rape, robbery and murder. What were people capable of back then? What drove them to these brutal acts? And how do criminals exploit the chaos of the post-war years? Germany after the Second World War. Many cities are reduced to rubble. 1 in 3 people are homeless.
The years 1945 to 49 are some of the most understudied years in German history because there is in the history books it's told there is the history until 1945 with the apocalyptic end, and then you have the founding of the 2 competing German states in 49. In these 4 very formative years, they are messy, they are complicated, but they are formative.
With the war over, the 4 allies are in power. They divide the country up. The pretty town of Garmisch-Partenkirchen is in the American-occupied zone at the foot of the Alps. And it becomes the scene of a grisly murder. This small place is nestled close to the Zugspitze, Germany's highest mountain. One December morning in 1947, a housemaid makes a horrific discovery. The restaurant owner Zenta Hausner lies lifeless on her kitchen floor, her skull smashed in.
It must have been a pretty horrible sight. Zenta lying on the floor in her dressing gown, her red hair in a pool of blood, her skull smashed, and a knife through her neck, pinning her to the floorboards.
When the police arrive, curious neighbors hinder their work. Possible clues are rendered useless. Why was she murdered? And who was this woman?
By 1945, she was 35 years old. She had red hair, and she was actually referred to by the popular press at the time as the Red Princess, Garmisch now, the Queen of Hearts. She was a bubbly person, she was personable, she was generous.
British writer Ian Sayer has a private archive where, for years, he's been gathering information about the post-war era in Germany, including the Zenta Hausner case. During the war, she ran a popular restaurant in Munich. She was considered an ardent Nazi sympathizer. She's alleged to have had a relationship with the head of the regional Nazi party, the Gauleiter of Upper Bavaria. In 1944, Zenta Hausner moves to Garmisch-Partenkirchen on the border with Austria. This idyllic place attracts all kinds of people.
A lot of rich German people had actually gone south down to Garmisch, and they'd and there were a lot of adventurers and opportunists and criminals and ex-soldiers, ex-officers, and so on. So it was a real mix of people. all of those things conspired to make it really easy for smuggling and illegal black marketeering and trafficking in narcotics, platinum, uranium, gold, currency, silver, you name it, they did it.
Over 5,000 American GIs are stationed in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. They love the mountains and the luxury of this alpine sports town.
Die Amerikaner haben natürlich hier auch,
The Americans requisitioned villas and hotels for their forces to stay in.
ihre
Of course, the
Streitkräfte
officers
dort wohnen zu
bagged the
lassen,
most
Offiziere
beautiful
haben sich die
villas for
schönsten Villen
themselves.
natürlich unter den Nagel gerissen.
But behind the facade lurks a shadowy world.
A lot of the American military were involved in cigarette smuggling, drug smuggling, and of course many of the Germans as well. So yeah, totally lawless in Garmisch at that time, totally.
Everyone meets at the Weisses Rössel, Zenta Hausner's restaurant. An affair with an American officer allows her to take over the popular establishment. He makes sure her connections with the Nazis are swept under the table. The Weisses Rössel is a refuge for anyone wanting to escape the harsh world beyond its doors, but also a popular watering hole for the criminal underworld at night. And the charismatic landlady knows how to manipulate smugglers and tricksters, GIs and policemen. A tabloid newspaper describes her as the Queen of Hearts of the Garmisch underground. The tavern still exists today. It's now a Greek restaurant. Petra Habeisen-Unruh has studied the history of Garmisch-Partenkirchen intensively, as well as the Zenta Hausner case.
Ich denke, dass das Weiße Rössel schon
I think the
einige
Weisses
Umbauten
Rössel was rebuilt a bit,
Grundsubstanz schon noch da
but the
ist,
basic
diese
structure is still intact.
die, so
Above
viele
all, the
Nischen
nooks
zum
and
Muschen
crannies,
und
which allowed people to be
Verhandlungen
discreet
im
and do their
Handel
deals on the
diese
black
ganzen
market.
Schwarzmarktgeschäfte.
Zenta Hausner is a sharp businesswoman and has ears and eyes everywhere. And she knows how to turn sensitive information into profit.
She was working for different sections of the US military. I mean, absolutely amazing. She played one side off against the other. She was working for the American Army Counterintelligence Corps detachment in Garmisch, which is counter-espionage. She worked for the US Army Criminal Investigation Department.
A secret document from the American military police shows they are handling Frau Hausner, the narcotics dealer, and that information from this source has proved invaluable. Zenta Hausner is leading a risky double life, and she knows it. She confesses to a friend how scared she is. That fear is not unfounded. The American occupying forces are planning to take action. The US Army already has a detailed report about the shady things going on in the town. Mention is also made of Zenta Hausner. Even General Lucius D. Clay, military governor of the US zone in Germany, is informed. Zenta Hausner knows none of this. On the 22nd of December, she has a get-together with friends in her flat above the Weisses Rössel. Her lover and an American officer are also present. They left at 3:30 in the morning, her guests testify later. Did Zenta Hausner have another visitor that night? Carsten Barbian is a pathologist at the University Clinic in Leipzig. He has analysed the police report and put together his own theory about that mysterious night.
I think she met someone she knew. Otherwise, she wouldn't have let him in at this hour, and certainly wouldn't have received this person in a dressing gown.
Ich denke, es war ein Bekannter.
I think it was an acquaintance with whom she ate and drank. This wasn't a carefully planned murder. There was an argument, a fight. Emotions ran high.
Gefühle sind hochgekocht. Es wurden wohl
The weapons used in the attack were from the kitchen, suggesting a spontaneous act.
was dafür spricht, dass es eine spontane Tat war.
Zenta Hausner is brutally stabbed with her own kitchen knife. Her severe head wounds were probably made by an axe. It was never found. The police initially believe they're dealing with a robbery and murder. Expensive items of jewellery are missing. But 15,000 rice marks left in the living room were not taken. The investigators are mystified. Neighbours and acquaintances are questioned. Unsuccessfully. Nobody knows anything. But there is one clue. The evening before the murder, a man was seen standing in front of her house. Who is this stranger? There's lots of speculation about the dubious business dealings of the murdered woman and her many lovers.
Zenta
Hausner had several affairs, one after the other. They generally ended quickly, and there was probably some jealousy involved. I think it must have been a crime of passion involving someone's hurt feelings, like revenge or rejection, or something like that.
One of her lovers is briefly detained, but there's not enough evidence against him. The US military also investigate. The case files disappeared and have never been found. Were Americans also involved in the case? Did somebody want to silence Zenta Hausner?
A lot of Americans thought that it was a German murderer, and most of the Germans thought it was an American murderer. I suppose I'm sort of more inclined to think it might have been an American than a German, because although it's circumstantial, sending Zenta Hausner's name to the military governor of Germany, not Bavaria, but to Germany, a week before she was murdered, I mean, too coincidental, if you like.
Ian Sayer is still hunting for the missing piece of jewellery. It could yet help solve this mysterious case.
Well, perhaps because of this distinctive bracelet, because even, 70-odd years later, this is a very distinctive piece of jewellery, and if it's still intact, it's worth a lot of money. There may be somebody who's seen it in a jewellery case somewhere. Somebody may have actually had it to alter, to change. It's so distinctive that somebody might recognise it, or recognise having done something with it, and that could lead to solving the crime, of course.
The case of Zenta Hausner is the story of a morally ambivalent woman looking to profit in difficult times. Maybe that sealed her fate. The post-war years posed major challenges for women. Until 1945, many have to look after themselves and provide for their children alone. If their husbands do ever come back from the front, they often don't get on anymore. Many couples divorce. 3 times as many as before the war. About 1 million women in the Western occupied zones live as war widows. If they marry again, they face losing their widow's pension. These are hard times.
People's experience of violence in the Nazi era and in the war didn't just remain in their heads. The years right after the war were also an era of violence.
Women in particular were at risk. They were frequently victims of sex crimes. Actress Ursula Herking has a terrible experience in the dying days of the war. The 33-year-old has been working in a theatre in Prague. She has to walk the 200 kilometers back to her family in Bavaria. There are no trains. She recalls what happened in her autobiography.
I was walking along a country road. No vehicles, nobody around. After 2 hours, I felt very tired. I sat down on the edge of the woods to rest. I took a piece of bread out of my rucksack, but I didn't manage to eat it.
American soldiers pull up in a jeep in front of her.
The first one took me a bit away from the others. They looked on. It took 4 minutes. I looked at my watch.
Ursula Hacking is raped by 2 other American soldiers. Then they let her go. The young woman has to continue walking and drag herself home. The journey takes her over a week. Rapes are part of the cruelty of the Second World War. Soldiers of the German army alone rape hundreds of thousands of women in the occupied territories. Now the Allies rape German women.
Rape, especially in the last days of the war, was a mass phenomenon in Germany. 2015, there was a study that came to the number of 860,000 German women that were raped by Allied occupation soldiers, of which roughly a quarter of them must have been American.
According to other estimates, there were more than 1 million victims of rape. The crimes were often carried out as a group, so comrades became accomplices, and they hushed up their crimes together. It's an expression of a deep disgust towards the Germans, part of the rage and aggression that has become pent up during the war.
This humiliation and shaming of the enemy is part of a military strategy which isn't just aimed at individual women, but against all male enemies as well, and ultimately the nation. Because in a patriarchal culture, anything you do to women, you're also doing to men.
Gleichzeitig auch gegen den Mann gerichtet ist.
Lydia Benneker explains why very few women actually report being raped.
Back then, the only way of dealing with it was not to talk about it and to just forget it. Just as all other war traumas were typically dealt with by suppressing them and remaining silent, people also saw war rapes as part of war and something that had to be left behind in some way after the war. Families didn't talk about it. Even if they had seen their daughters or sisters being raped, they continued to live as if nothing had happened.
For many women, the shame is too great, but also the fear of being seen as collaborators with the occupiers.
In that situation, women just hoped that they wouldn't become pregnant, and that as a result, nobody would find out. They were also faced with the threat of being labelled an Ami lover or a Veronika Dankeschön, the pejorative terms people used for women who became intimate with US soldiers.
The widely accepted prejudice was that these women had thrown themselves at the Americans in their desperation. That's why rape victims like Ursula Hacking rarely report these crimes. And when they do, not much happens.
Going to the police was basically impossible. The police couldn't do anything about the occupying soldiers, or more precisely in this case, against US soldiers. They were absolutely immune to the German authorities. But sometimes, and I think this is very brave and impressive, rape victims would go to the barracks and try and confront those who raped them, and even accuse them in front of their commanding officers.
The military police of the Allied occupying power in that region are responsible for dealing with rapes by Allied soldiers. The cases, if they come to court at all, are dealt with by military courts.
The chances to find some kind of judicial remedy for rape were not good. If it's not only a he said, she said scenario, which is not good in the first place, but also she, former Nazi, said, he, liberator, said scenario. And that a lot depended on the assessment of the superiors of the soldier in question.
A rape is only recognized by an American military court if the woman put up significant resistance. If she didn't, because she was raped at gunpoint, for example, then she had little chance of success. It's a logic that Ursula Herking appears to understand. She writes,
I wasn't raped because I didn't resist.
That is also a defense strategy, to try and persuade herself that I am not a victim, I survived and now I can put that aside. She might also tragically have blamed herself, which is something that rape victims often do. Possibly because she decided not to resist as a result of a survival instinct. It's a huge problem because many victims of sexual violence experience feelings of guilt afterwards and ask themselves if they should have done something differently. The tragic answer is that there is no generally valid strategy, and a victim is never guilty, whatever they do.
even if a case does come to trial, the soldiers often provide each other with alibis, and their superiors don't want to know about such crimes. But things are very different when it comes to Afro-American soldiers.
The prosecution rates among the American military judiciary differ. African-American soldiers had to contend oftentimes with the racism of their superiors. African-American servicemen bitterly complained that they did not experience the same kind of loyalty from their superiors as white comrades in arms.
They only account for 10% of American occupying forces, but Afro-American soldiers are punished more frequently and harsher than white soldiers. Many women and girls could never forget the violence they experienced in the post-war years. And just like Ursula Herking, they never received justice. War and Nazi dictatorship left their marks. More than 8 million German prisoners of war return home well into the 1950s. Many men are physically scarred and traumatized, and have committed and witnessed atrocities. But violence and death are not over yet. A mysterious series of murders is committed in northern Germany after the end of the war. Like everywhere in Germany, there's a lack of housing in Hamburg. Hundreds of thousands of people are squeezed into the ruins of the bombed-out port city. The winter is going to be hard.
What's referred to as the Winter of Starvation of 1946 to 47 is considered the worst winter in the North Sea region in the 20th century. Temperatures fell below minus 20 degrees Celsius. The Elbe River froze over. So people were basically trapped in the cities. It was cold, there was no heating, and nothing to eat.
The misery was particularly harsh in the center of Hamburg. Hinrichsenstraße, the former Baustraße. Behind this gate, there used to be the remains of a bombed-out factory. For many children in Hamburg, the ruins are an adventure playground. This is where they seek escape from the harshness of daily life. On the 20th of January 1947, they make a horrible discovery. the corpse of a woman lying among the rubble. She's naked and has no personal effects. The police can't identify her, just noting her blonde hair and blue eyes. They think the young woman is about 20. The police hand the body over to forensics. Carsten Barbian has analyzed their report.
They found strangulation marks around the neck, so it's clear she was strangled to death.
The pathologist estimates that the young woman's body had been lying in the rubble for about 24 hours. He has various theories about why her clothing has gone.
Maybe the perpetrator stripped her to make it more difficult to identify her. Maybe her clothes were stolen because they were expensive and the person wanted to sell them. In the post-war era, most items of clothing were valuable. The killing took place somewhere where the perpetrator could be sure they wouldn't be discovered. And then they brought the naked body to where it was found under the cover of darkness.
The police files make no mention of rape, but they do contain another unusual detail.
She's described as looking well kept. She had delicate hands, not the hands of a working woman. And there were no signs of malnourishment. So she seems to be a woman from above average or privileged economic circumstances.
The only people who are well nourished after the war are the occupiers. There are some 30,000 British soldiers in Hamburg. Many officers have even brought their families. The German police start to investigate, but nobody can identify the woman. At Hamburg police headquarters, they're hoping for hints from the population. The investigators publish posters featuring an image of the dead woman. The police work on the basis that this was a combined robbery and murder and ask who knows the deceased. The reward for leads, 1,000 Reichsmarks, about 3,000 euros. However, it's the British occupiers who decide how the police in Hamburg operate. They also make sure that those with Nazi pasts are fired.
The police and the SS had very close ties. The police as an institution was basically the system used by the Third Reich to terrorize people and suppress dissent. It wasn't just the Gestapo who did that.
Almost 1,200 police officers in Hamburg are suspended because of their involvement with the Nazis. The only police employed after the end of the war were those who had been officers before the Nazi era or very young and inexperienced officers. The Allies don't want the German police to carry weapons yet. They have to make do with a truncheon. 5,000 police officers operated in Hamburg at that time, half the number in the city today. The officers of the homicide department continue to try and find out more about the murdered woman. A few days later, another body is found in the rubble. A man about 60. He's also naked and looks well groomed. Nearby is a walking stick. Like the woman, he's also been strangled to death. The crime scene is 7 kilometers away from the first body on the other side of the Alster Lake. The investigators wonder whether there's a connection between the two bodies. Were they perhaps even killed at the same time? Again, the police assume it's a combined murder and robbery. The investigation focuses on Hamburg's black market. The murderer might try and barter clothing and valuables found on the victims. But they fail to turn up any clues. In early February 1947, another body turns up, again in central Hamburg. The victim is again found in the rubble of a factory in an old lift shaft, this time a 6-year-old girl. Fears grow that this is a serial killer.
It's interesting that after this third find, when the little girl was found, it was then that the head of the police wrote a letter to Hamburg school senator.
Children and teenagers are to be made aware of these dangers.
And he said, we have 3 murders here, and now a small child. So there exists a danger that perhaps this is part of a series, and we don't know whether other children might be approached. Please inform your schools about this. And since this involves a child, please ask them whether any children are missing.
Relatives, schoolmates, or neighbors must have noticed that the little girl was missing a while back. Yet the police have no clues. The investigations are going nowhere. The chaos of the post-war era makes police work difficult. Thousands of people stream into the cities, former soldiers, prisoners of war, and refugees, Holocaust survivors, and forced laborers. The police suspect the victims themselves may be recent arrivals to Hamburg. People don't have to register their addresses, and they live wherever they can, between the rubble of bombed-out houses, in cellars and ruins. It seems impossible to identify the dead. But that's not the last of it. 10 days later, another body is found in a cellar. A woman of about 30, also strangled. Her corpse is found just a few kilometers from the other crime scenes. She seems to have been murdered at the same time as the little girl. This is the 4th body in 4 weeks. The crimes are all over the headlines. Fear courses through Hamburg. Powerless, the police advise people to stay away from bomb sites.
As always in difficult times, criminality surges. There is more of it. So this volume of murders and robberies is typical for the post-war era.
The Hamburg police are massively under pressure. They distribute thousands of posters. The reward for a tip-off leading to an arrest is raised to 10,000 Reichsmarks. In vain. Officers are still in the dark and can only speculate what the connection between the murder victims is.
Several things suggest that this might even be a family. We have an older man who could be the grandfather. We have a woman of about 30 or 40. She could be the mother. And then these 2 children, one 6 to 8, and this other young girl. So it is possible.
Today, it would be easy to establish a family connection via DNA analysis. Back then, all the police had was fingerprints of the deceased.
Unlike DNA characteristics, fingerprints are not inherited, so looking at the fingerprints won't enable you to establish whether they're related.
The string of murders remains a mystery, as does the motive of the perpetrator. Criminal psychologist Lydia Benecke has some ideas.
The little that we know suggests that the perpetrator initially planned to rob them and to kill each of these people so as to get their valuables. This wasn't a crime of passion following an argument. There is no evidence to suggest that. This perpetrator must have been an extreme narcissist, because most violent people won't harm a child when it comes down to it, especially not in such a premeditated way, and actually go ahead and kill them.
After the 4th body is found, the murder spree ends as abruptly as it began. The people of Hamburg breathe a sigh of relief. The officers of the homicide squad investigate for another year, but without success. The killer is never caught.
It might well be the case that the person or people responsible left the country, and that they could have taken the valuables they'd acquired and boarded a ship in Hamburg to some place in the world, and either managed to establish a new life for themselves there, or possibly committed further killings that we know nothing about.
Dozens of people are murdered in Hamburg in the years after the war. Many of these cases are solved. But with the bomb site murders, the guilty party disappears in the confusion of the post-war era. Over a year and a half earlier, in the summer of 1945, the goal of the Potsdam Conference is to bring order to the chaos. At Sicilienhof Palace, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, US President Harry S. Truman, and the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin decide how to deal with defeated Germany.
At Potsdam, all allies agreed on to punish Germany for the crimes it had committed during the Nazi regime, but also to provide the German people with a perspective of post-war rehabilitation.
The Allied powers focus on 4 points: denazification and decentralization, disarmament, and democracy. But for many Germans, it's just about surviving, sometimes at any price. Like here at the German-Belgian border near Aachen. Tank traps from the Second World War are still in place today. The border is also known as the Hökerlinie, the hump line. After the end of the war, dozens of children and young people cross the border here every day on foot or by bicycle. A dangerous undertaking. They're crossing the border at the Coffee Front, the spot where Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands meet. In Germany, a kilo of coffee is taxed at up to 50 Deutschmarks, a lot of money for the time. On the black market, coffee beans are known as black gold and even used as currency. Customs officials are under strict instructions to stop coffee being smuggled across the border. With whatever means necessary.
Smuggling and the black market in smuggled goods deprive national and regional governments of several hundred million in taxes. But whether the smugglers are small or large, they will all eventually be caught.
Most people in the border zone are smuggling for private consumption. Very few people can actually afford to buy coffee. Many of the smugglers are underage. Customs officials are powerless in the face of their tactics.
There were these huge bands of children known as Rabatze in German, or rowdies. 100 or 200 children crossed the border as a group. They were between 14 and 17 years old. Their advantage was they couldn't be punished like adults. When the customs officials came, they literally got rowdy. They jeered and whistled and ran in all directions, and the customs men couldn't really lay a finger on them or catch them.
Their tactics are portrayed in a post-war German movie. It was filmed in Aachen on the German side of the border. Antonio Moll was one of these rowdies. He's 7 years old when he starts his smuggling career. His family is fighting for survival. They exchange the coffee for food when they're back in Germany.
We usually met here. We would run across the railway tracks in a large pack as far as the tunnel, and then through the tunnel. And then we would be in Belgium. Then we bought coffee or cigarettes or food and went back. The tank traps of the Hökerlinie were really useful. You could hide quite well behind them, and the customs officials didn't see you.
The children are risking their lives every time they cross the border. Smuggling is considered a particularly serious crime.
The main difference between the customs officers and the police is that customs were allowed to carry weapons at the border, while German police officers were not allowed to carry weapons. And they were also told to use their weapons when the situation required it. They were ordered to shoot. Weapons were allowed.
The customs authorities make it known that those fleeing who have provoked the use of weapons as a result of their actions are responsible for the consequences. It says the officers cannot be made liable. This policy protects the estimated 1,000 customs officials in the region around Aachen from legal consequences. Most of them are badly trained and unable to cope with the job. It's only a matter of time before someone gets killed. On the 27th of December 1947, a customs officer notices a boy on a bicycle. He's on his way back from Belgium to Germany.
14-year-old Horst Klinger was cycling up the road. Visibility was bad. It was a bit dark already. A customs official hailed him and told him to stop. The boy carried on. After hailing him again, the officer got out his weapon.
The bullet strikes Horst Klinger's head. He dies on the spot, just a few hundred meters from his parents' house. In his bag, they find half a pound of coffee, some cocoa, and a packet of baking powder. The customs official later testified that he believed to be addressing an adult. He said he had only wanted to fire at the bicycle. Just a deadly mistake?
The really tragic thing about this case is that Horst Klinger was himself the son of a customs official, and the smuggled goods he had with him were not very significant. A really tragic case overall, especially as he was the only child of the Klinger family.
In the police file, the word accident is noted as the cause of death. The customs officer never has to account for his actions. But cases like these don't go unnoticed.
When somebody was shot dead at the border, people weren't just upset. They took their grievances to the customs officers. People organized marches in their villages and protested about the treatment of the smugglers by customs officials, and demanded that they stop using their weapons.
Today, some people still don't understand why the measures taken had to be so draconian.
We didn't do it for the fun. We had to survive. And they shot you if you didn't stop. There were court cases too, but the customs officials were always let off. That's just the way it was.
The church also stands by the smugglers. In his New Year's address, the Archbishop of Cologne, Josef Frings, justifies theft and smuggling if people are doing it to survive. Since then, the people of the Rhineland have had a new verb for stealing out of want: Fringsen. Coffee duty is not reduced until 1953. Many Germans are starting to do better, and they now buy coffee in their own country. But until then, Horst Klinger and 25 other people lose their lives at the border. Another 100 are injured. In the post-war years, Nazi leaders are vigorously prosecuted by the Allies. Starting with the Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, and during which top Nazis like Hermann Göring were brought to justice. For the war of aggression, crimes towards the civilian population, and the Holocaust.
After the big trial held by the International Military Court in Nuremberg against the key war criminals, there were a host of subsequent trials that continued until 1948 and 1949. War criminals and top Nazis were still being executed in 1948.
A total of 36 perpetrators are condemned to death at the Nuremberg trials. The sentence was carried out in 22 of those cases. They would not be the last death sentences before the founding of the Federal Republic of Germany. In January 1948, Richard Schuh hitches a ride with a truck driver. A recent returnee from the war, he's decided to steal the vehicle. During the trip, he pulls out his old army pistol and shoots the driver 3 times. Richard Schuh pulls his victim out of the truck and hides the body in a ditch by the road under a tarpaulin. Did he intend to kill him?
If you fire 3 shots from a relatively close distance and hit someone in the head and chest, then you know you're going to cause deadly or potentially deadly injuries.
That same night, a police patrol finds the body. The hunt for the killer begins right away. Meanwhile, Richard Schuh is trying to sell the truck's wheels. His thinking is that selling the whole truck could draw too much attention. But the wheelless truck hidden in the woods is found by a forester. He immediately notices splashes of blood in the driver's cab. When Richard Schuh tries to hide the wheels, he's arrested. Just 3 days after the crime. Did the violence he experienced in the German army turn him into a murderer?
The judge said that on the one hand, a person is more likely to use weapons when they already know how to use one and also know what it feels like to kill a person. On the other hand, the judge also said quite correctly that many people fought in the war, but very few would commit such a crime, and that it's not a sufficient explanation for such an act.
In May 1945, Schuh returned to his native Tübingen after a short time as a prisoner of war. He finds it difficult to settle down, has 2 children and doesn't support them, working as a casual labourer.
He didn't really try to find a job he could stick at. He moved around and committed robberies and was totally restless.
The court convicts Richard Schuh of murder and aggravated robbery and condemns him to death. He's scheduled to be executed in the following year, February 1949. At the same time, the Parliamentary Council is meeting in Bonn. The job of its members is to draw up a constitution for Germany and usher in a new political era. The death penalty is also part of those discussions.
Demands to repeal the death sentence were initially made by a party which wanted to stop former Nazis being executed by Allied military courts. The chairman of the Central Committee of the Parliamentary Council, Carlo Schmidt, argued that the death penalty should be abolished, but not to protect former Nazis, of course. He pointed to the thousands of death sentences handed down by the Nazis and argued that the new Federal Republic of Germany had to show that it was based on totally different values and that every life deserves to be protected, even that of a murderer.
A total of 33,000 people were condemned to death by courts under the Nazis and executed. Politicians like Konrad Adenauer, who would later become Chancellor, want to retain the death penalty. Many Germans support him.
The whole issue of the death penalty shows that not much had changed in people's heads after 1945. A majority of Germans still supported it. And if there'd been a referendum on the death penalty in 1948, it would have been kept in place.
Richard Schuh isn't privy to these political debates. He's spending the last few weeks remaining to him in a cell. On the 7th of July 1948, his family makes an appeal for clemency. The prison warden supports the appeal. The warden says that Schuh has recognized the severity and evil of his crime and shows genuine and bitter remorse. The death of his mother contributed to his change of character, says the warden. She drowned herself after his sentence was announced. Schuh is hoping for a last-minute stay. It's a race against time. But his family's plea for clemency is rejected. Even with discussions about scrapping the death penalty in full swing, it seems help will come too late.
Richard Schuh clearly hoped to the very end that he would not be executed. And when he found out that he really was going to be executed the next day at 6 a.m., he was genuinely shocked and scared and became very emotional.
Until the very end, the young man writes letters and desperately tries to explain his crime. The execution is carried out on the 18th of February, 1949. The executioner installs the guillotine in the inner courtyard of Tübingen prison. It has to be brought in especially for the execution. Journalist Hans-Joachim Lang works in Tübingen. He has studied the case.
It was 6 o'clock in the morning. 12 witnesses were present from the town. Richard Schuh was brought in. The priest recited a short prayer with him. And the chief prosecutor said to the executioner, "I give you Richard Schuh for you to make him pass from life to death." They say he was quite calm in those last few seconds.
Seine letzten Sekunden entgegengegangen sei.
Richard Schuh dies aged 28 under the guillotine. The execution bell rings out at Tübingen City Hall. It's the last death sentence carried out on the orders of a West German court. With the introduction of Germany's constitution, its basic law, the death penalty is abolished. This legal text is the foundation of the new Federal Republic, founded on the 23rd of May, 1949, under the eyes of the whole world. Its first chancellor is CDU politician Konrad Adenauer.
This schoolhouse meeting in Bonn may live in history as the birth of a new free nation for Germany.
The 23rd of May 1949 is regarded as a new beginning, after National Socialism, but also after the turbulence of the post-war years. Those years shaped the Federal Republic of Germany and continue to do so today.